Instantly staking claim to the center opens avenues for rapid piece development and a dynamic game. Instantly challenging white's central pawn, this opening creates asymmetrical pawn structures and opens pathways for rapid piece development. Developing the knight to f3 immediately challenges black's central ambitions, preparing to expand in the center while keeping the king safe. Solidifying the center and preparing for a classic Sicilian structure, this move signals immediate strategic intentions. Asserting immediate pressure, this bishop advance disrupts black's pawn structure and prepares for potential piece exchanges. Developing a piece and reinforcing the pawn chain is a sensible response, solidifying the center. Sacrificing the bishop for the knight creates an imbalanced pawn structure, weakening black's queenside. Reclaiming the pawn with the b-file opens a pathway for the queen and rook, but creates doubled pawns, a significant structural weakness. Solidifying the king's safety now is paramount after the disruptive exchange, allowing for central pressure. Opening the center with this pawn thrust immediately contests white's central control and promises active piece play for black. Securing the e-file with the rook strengthens white's central influence and prepares for potential pawn advances, a sound positional move. Developing the knight harmonizes piece activity, contesting central control and preparing for further pawn advances. Solidifying the center and preparing a queenside expansion, but it slightly hinders development. Developing the bishop to attack the knight and disrupt white's queenside pawn structure creates immediate tactical opportunities. Consolidating pawn structure while preparing to develop the queen's bishop is the aim, but it slightly concedes central control. Fortifying the king's safety, the bishop repositions to a more passive but secure square, anticipating future development. Developing the knight to d2 conserves the kingside bishop's diagonal for potential future pressure on black's queenside pawn structure. The knight pivots, seeking a bolder outpost and reinforcing the pawn chain's integrity. Challenging the bishop's influence, white seeks to gain a tempo and potentially create weaknesses on the kingside, but opens a diagonal. Re-establishing the bishop's diagonal presence, this maneuver aims to contest the d-file and potentially support a kingside pawn push later on. Cracking open the center with d4 immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens lines for white's pieces. Opening the central d-file suddenly forces white to re-evaluate pawn structure and king safety. Opening the c-file creates immediate pressure on black's isolated doubled pawns and hints at future pawn storms. Finally, the king finds safety behind the pawn wall, a crucial step for immediate security. The queen now surveys the queenside, probing for weaknesses and potentially preparing a central pawn push. The queen's repositioning prepares for central pawn breaks and eyes the kingside. Shifting the knight to f1 prepares a kingside expansion or a timely g4 push. Reinforcing the central e-file opens pathways for piece activity, eyeing weaknesses around white's king. Unveiling an attacking battery, white aims to exploit the d-pawn's forward march and black's slightly awkward knight placement, creating potential for a swift kingside invasion. Seeking safety, the bishop retreats to a passive square, sacrificing central influence for piece preservation amidst the growing pawn chain. Knight now aims to control central squares, potentially supporting a kingside attack or reinforcing the queen's influence. Challenging the center, black seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and unlock his pieces, a bold but potentially risky decision. Opening the d-file for your rooks injects immediate dynamism into the center, directly challenging black's pawn chain. Reclaiming the center with the pawn establishes a more active pawn chain, aiming to control vital central squares and potentially unblock the dark-squared bishop. Unlocking the queenside diagonal offers surprising pressure, aiming to exploit the weakened black pawn structure. Securing the queen on its current diagonal enhances defensive coverage and prepares for potential pawn advances. Anchoring the rook here, white aims to bolster the e-file and prepare for potential pressure, a subtle yet crucial step. Asserting control over the semi-open, c, file now offers a strong avenue for pressure. Preparing to wrestle for queenside space, eyeing the weak c6 pawn. Unlocking the c-file for black's rook, while developing a tactical threat against the white queen. Sacrificing material to seize control of the central dark squares is a bold gambit. Suddenly opening the diagonal for the queen, this capture disrupts white's central pawn structure and creates immediate attacking potential against the isolated d3 pawn. Shifting the queen back here prepares for a potential queenside expansion, aiming to improve piece coordination. Unlocking the queenside is the primary goal here, hoping to exploit white's slightly passive bishop placement. Unlocking the center with this knight repositions him for crucial central control and potential kingside attack. Seeking to unlock the queenside and disrupt white's pawn structure, this knight repositions for active play. Expanding along the queenside aims to wrest queenside space and disrupt black's pawn structure. Recapturing the bishop on f8 sacrifices tempi for pawn structure, inviting further piece pressure. Shifting the knight to g4 aims to pressure the f6 knight and potentially open lines towards black's castled king. Securing the king's immediate safety by preventing white's knight from infiltrating is paramount. Initiating an attack on the kingside becomes more feasible as the bishop shifts to a more active diagonal. This audacious knight sortie aims to disrupt white's queenside structure and challenge the central pawns, introducing dynamic possibilities. Stabilizing the knight and preparing for a potential pawn break creates a more resilient structure. Unleashing the queen from its passive post, this move aims to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially create tactical opportunities along the open b-file. Knight's daring sortie, this knight's hop to f5 boldly probes black's queenside defense, aiming to exploit weaknesses or initiate exchanges. The king retreats to a safer haven, seeking refuge from the imminent storm brewing on the kingside. Recentralizing the knight prepares for potential queenside advances and strengthens the central pawn structure. Exchanging the knights resolves positional tension, opening lines for the rook and simplifying the position. Recapturing the knight injects some central dynamism and prepares for future pawn advances on the kingside. Opening that d-file promises a sharp positional struggle, potentially exploiting the slightly exposed black king. Liberating the knight to attack the d4 pawn and disrupt black's central control offers immediate dynamic possibilities. This recapture on b7 seeks to untangle the queen and potentially threaten the central pawn structure. Targeting the queenside pawn structure, this knight repositions for a potential endgame advantage. Reclaiming the central squares with the queen is a bold attempt to reignite black's initiative. Fortifying the king's sanctuary is paramount after the pawn sacrifice, aiming to solidify white's defensive structure against black's potential kingside threats. Shifting the bishop to a more active square, this knight-hunting maneuver aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines for attack. Reopening the d-file offers a crucial route to activate the rook and target black's isolated pawns. Unlocking the d-file, this pawn thrust creates immediate activity and threatens to unravel white's kingside. Clearing the d-file opens aggressive possibilities against black's vulnerable king. Recapturing the rook on the open file is essential for defending the pawn chain and preventing further white infiltration. Securing the queen's escape route opens up a fascinating fight for the d-file. Activating the bishop to contest open diagonals while preparing for potential pawn advances opens up new attacking avenues. Exploiting the pinned knight, white forces a material exchange with immediate king safety concerns for black. Reclaiming the open file offers a glimmer of counterplay, forcing white to confront the potential of black's rook. Unleashing the queen allows for dangerous kingside attacks, but it leaves the white king oddly exposed. Seeking counterplay, this queen maneuver activates a dormant piece and eyes potential threats along the central files. Unleashing the f-pawn offers a desperate but necessary attack, hoping to break open the king's defenses amidst the positional chaos. Sacrificing the pawn opens a dangerous diagonal for black's queen, directly threatening the white king. A calculated sacrifice to dislodge the defender and expose the king's weak squares. The monarch's flight toward the queenside offers some respite, but the open g-file remains a constant threat. Sacrificing the queen to eliminate immediate threats simplifies the position and aims to exploit black's exposed king in the ensuing endgame. Sacrificing the bishop opens the king to devastating checks. A bold pawn advance, aiming to pry open lines for the remaining rook and potentially create mating threats against the exposed black king. Reconnecting the bishop to the kingside defense stabilizes black's precarious position against the relentless queenside pressure. Repositioning the knight to b3 aims to exploit the weakened c5 square and pressure black's backward pawn structure. Finally challenging white's rook pair, this pawn break aims to activate the rook and disrupt the opponent's queenside. Repositioning the knight offers an escape from the pin and a potential outpost on a more active square. Unleashing a desperate check, black probes the exposed white monarch, seeking any respite in this lost position. Securing the bishop's retreat lane prevents immediate tactical setbacks for white. Eliminating this bishop removes a key defender of white's vulnerable king. Capturing the pawn finally resolves the material deficit, though the passed pawn on a7 will be a constant threat. Capturing the rook abandons the pawn and offers little compensation for the lost material. Capturing the advanced pawn is logical, aiming to simplify and exploit the exposed black king in the endgame. Stepping the king into this open space offers activity, but exposes it to potential checks down the line. Saving the king from the looming diagonal pressure, preparing to regroup. The black king, now exposed on the flank, has become a beacon for relentless pursuit, creating a dangerous tactical free-for-all. Unlocking the king's diagonal creates a dangerous invasion point. The bishop retreats, abandoning the fight for central squares and allowing white to solidify their king's safety. Activating the king is paramount to defend against the tenacious rook and pawns. Reactivating the bishop to a more dynamic diagonal, aiming to exploit the weakened light squares. Solidifying the bishop's grip on the long diagonal aims to restrict black's passive pieces. Sacrificing the pawn to drag the opposing monarch into a vulnerable square is a desperate attempt to create counterplay. Navigating the pawn storm requires careful king repositioning to escape immediate threats. Unmasking the king offers a desperate attempt to disrupt white's mating net, hoping to create chaos. The king's square is too exposed. It's a dangerous position to be in. Sacrificing the king's safety to try and dislodge the enemy rook from the critical 8th rank is a desperate gamble, but it might be the only way to disrupt white's attacking rhythm. Unleashing a decisive king hunt, the rook now aggressively targets the exposed monarch. Your king's exposed position after accepting the pawn now invites a devastating discovered attack and swift material loss, a common pitfall in desperate king hunts. The white rook now claims the open file, pressuring the pinned black pieces and exploiting the exposed king. A desperate king dash finds a swift, decisive checkmate threat. The king's exposed position opens a crucial tactical avenue. Black's bishop now activates, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety on the open diagonals. This rook's redeployment to the 7th rank immediately pressures the enemy pawn structure. Unleashing the rook's potential along the open file, a desperate gambit to disrupt white's triumphant march. Unlocking the king's escape route is the immediate priority, as the rook now has a clear path to safety. The king's exposed position after this exchange opens the door for devastating checks. King's exposed position leads to a forced sequence, sacrificing material to reach a simpler, winning endgame. The black king, now exposed, becomes a beacon for pursuing enemy pawns. Pushing the pawn aims to create a passed threat, but it risks weakening the king's pawn shield further. Pushing the pawn to f5 liberates black's king and attempts to generate counterplay on the queen side. Stepping forward with the rook aims to penetrate the black position, exploiting the open files and potentially targeting vulnerable pawns. The king bravely ventures out to support the passed pawn, hoping to create a mating net. Securing the rook on the open file, this pawn is now a tempting, yet ultimately sacrificial, target to activate the pieces further. Grasping the initiative, the pawn aggressively advances, seeking to disrupt white's defensive setup and create potential mating threats. Clearing the path for your rook with this timely check creates an unstoppable passed pawn. The king, now dangerously exposed on the open board, becomes the primary target for the advancing white rooks. Clearing the 6th rank enables the rook to actively menace the pawn's structure and potentially disrupt black's king's safety. This defensive maneuver attempts to neutralize white's attacking bishop on the c6 square and solidify black's position. The king's exposed position now allows a decisive check to force it into a strategically disadvantaged square. The king's exposed position now beckons the rook to hunt for decisive gains. Initiating a decisive rook sortie to harass the enemy monarch and capitalize on the exposed dark squares. Snatching control of the f-file with the pawn could open crucial lines for a last-ditch attack against white's king. Re-establishing pressure along the 2nd rank allows the rook to support potential advances and control key squares. The rook's relentless pressure forces the king back into a precarious defensive position. Forcing the king into a perpetual check is the only path to salvation here. The king's flight to safety is paramount now, a desperate bid for survival amidst the rook's imposing presence. Pushing this pawn further strains black's defenses and opens new avenues for attack. The rook now anchors itself, eyeing the open file and preparing to potentially harass the opponent's vulnerable monarch. The rook's advance to the 7th rank is a pivotal moment, aiming to cut off the opposing monarch and secure a winning advantage by promoting. Securing the rook on the open file prevents white's king from escaping and sets up potential passed pawn play. Consolidating the king's position provides a crucial defensive anchor as the passed pawn advances. The king's desperate dash for safety is hampered by the well-placed rook. King activation is paramount, bringing it into the fray to support the rook and threaten the remaining pawns. The king, having ventured too far, now faces immediate danger from the rook and queen's combined assault. Securing the rook on the 7th rank offers a slight respite and prepares to contest the open file. Unleashing the pawn's potential for a final desperate push towards promotion, aiming to disrupt white's advancing king. Securing the b-file offers vital counterplay, preventing black's king from finding further refuge and potentially opening lines for an attack. Escaping the discovered check with the king is paramount, but this allows the rook to swing into a potentially powerful position on the open file. The rook advances, preparing to sever the opposition's king from its essential support and control the crucial 7th rank. A desperate attempt to inject life into the game, sacrificing material for a potential mating attack, though the king looks quite exposed.